Alcatraz, the name alone carried weight like a curse, an island fortress rising cold and gray out of the San Francisco Bay, waves smashing against jagged rocks as if nature itself wanted to keep men from touching freedom. And on this rock stood the most feared prison America had ever known, a place the government built to say, escape is impossible, where murderers, gangsters, and the most stubborn criminals were locked away in concrete cells no wider than a man's outstretched arms, their days carved into monotony by steel doors, echoing footsteps, and the endless sound of the sea taunting them just beyond the bars. But among the hundreds who were sent here believing they would never leave, 3 ordinary men, Frank Morris and the brothers John and Clarence Anglin, looked at Alcatraz not as a tomb but as a puzzle waiting to be solved, and their story would one day make history as the only escape the FBI could never close. Because on the night of June 11, 1962, they simply vanished. Frank Morris was not a brute, not a gangster like Al Capone, but a thinker, born into poverty, abandoned as a child, shuffled through foster homes, learning early that survival required wit sharper than any blade, and by the time he reached adulthood, he had built a reputation inside prisons as a genius with an IQ reportedly higher than most college graduates, a man who studied maps, locks, routines, and weaknesses the way others studied textbooks. And though his crimes were robberies, his real obsession was with freedom itself. The Anglin brothers were different. Born into a large family of 13 children in rural Georgia, raised picking crops under the sun, poor but bound by loyalty, and when they grew up, their bond with each other became their strength, because wherever one went, the other followed, and when they eventually drifted into crime, bank robberies mostly, they always worked as a team. The system caught them, of course, and by the late 1950s they were bounced through prisons until fate brought them together with Morris inside the walls of Alcatraz. To outsiders, these men were just numbers, inmates swallowed by the rock. But behind the bars they watched, they studied, and slowly, quietly, they began to plan. Inside Alcatraz, time was a weapon and patience was currency, and Frank Morris knew that to beat the rock, he needed both. The cells were built like cages of concrete, each man boxed in by walls and steel, yet hidden inside every structure is weakness, and Morris found one in the ventilation grates. Behind his sink, a small vent no larger than a brick sat covered by a rusted grill, and with stolen spoons and makeshift tools, he began to chip away at the crumbling concrete around it, bit by bit, night after night, the sound masked by the prison's daily noise and by Morris's cunning plan of covering the hole with painted cardboard that blended perfectly with the wall. Soon the Anglin brothers joined him, attacking the vents in their own cells with the same slow precision, passing the concrete dust into pockets and spilling it out in the yard or flushing it away during chores. The holes grew wider, wide enough for a man to squeeze through, but this was only the first step, because once out of the cell, they needed a place to hide and build, and above the cell block lay a dark, unused corridor, a forgotten space where guards rarely ventured, and this became their secret workshop. By day they acted like obedient inmates, playing instruments in the prison band, sweeping floors, nodding silently to guards, but by night they vanished into the shadows above, turning stolen materials into tools of survival. They scavenged electric cords from vacuums to power their drills, sharpened spoons into chisels, and most famously, they began stitching together a raft and life vests out of raincoats, more than 50 of them, smuggled, stolen, and glued with a homemade concoction of rubber and heat from prison pipes. Each piece was a gamble, each night a risk, yet their determination grew like a fire that couldn't be put out. But there was still one obstacle. The guards checked every cell at night, shining flashlights through the bars to make sure each prisoner was in bed. One glance, one slip, and it would all end. So the men built their decoys, dummy heads crafted from plaster, soap, paint, and real human hair stolen from the barbershop. They sculpted faces, painted eyes, and laid them on pillows with towels shaped as bodies beneath blankets, so that when the guards passed, all they saw were sleeping inmates, breathing softly in the dark, unaware that the real men were crawling through holes in their cells toward freedom. Night after night, the plan took shape, a masterpiece of patience and silence, and while many prisoners before them had dreamed of escaping Alcatraz, none had come this close. They were no longer simply surviving inside the rock, they were preparing to beat it. June 11, 1962. The prison fell silent beneath the blanket of night, the steel doors locked, the bay winds howling outside like ghosts circling the rock. In cell block B, 3 men lay still in their bunks, heads turned away from the light, their chests rising as though in sleep. The guards, making their routine checks, swept their flashlights across the rows of prisoners, pausing only for a moment at the sight of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, seemingly fast asleep, their heads sunk deep into their pillows. But the truth was different. Those weren't men sleeping. They were decoys, plaster and paint, soap and hair, silent masks lying lifeless while the real men slipped quietly through the jagged holes carved in their cell walls. One by one they disappeared, squeezing into the narrow passages that ran behind the cells, crawling through darkness toward the service corridor above the block where their hidden workshop awaited. The hours ticked by as they gathered their gear, the stolen tools, the carefully stitched raincoat raft, the wooden paddles shaped crudely from scrap. They knew this was their only chance, the night when everything either broke free or broke apart forever. Moving like shadows, they climbed a utility shaft, forcing their way past a locked grate by wedging it open, then reaching the roof where the cold air of San Francisco Bay struck their faces. For the first time in years, they were outside the cage, standing on the crown of the prison known as escape-proof. Below them, floodlights swept across the yard, and the guards' footsteps echoed like hammers on steel, but in the black of night the men vanished across the rooftop, climbing down a network of pipes to reach the ground near the showers. There they carried the raft, folded, heavy, sticky with rubber patches, and hurried toward the northeast shoreline, a spot shielded from direct view by the island's rocky cliffs. The tide was strong, the waters icy cold, swirling with currents that had drowned countless men before them, but to Morris and the Anglin brothers it was freedom, the one door left open. They inflated the raft using a concertina fashioned from an accordion, another stolen prize, pumping air into the rubber until the craft rose from the rocks like a dark beast. Then, with paddles in hand, they pushed off into the night. The sound of waves swallowed their movements, and the prison lights behind them grew smaller, dimmer, until they disappeared altogether into the black expanse of the bay. When dawn broke, the guards discovered what had happened. At first, disbelief froze them. The plasterheads fooled even the warden himself when he saw them lying there, but the truth was undeniable. 3 of Alcatraz's most notorious prisoners were gone. The sirens wailed across the island, boats swept the waters, and helicopters circled overhead, but all they found were fragments. A paddle washed up on Angel Island, scraps of raincoat material floating near the Golden Gate, and a wallet belonging to one of the Anglins containing photographs and family contacts. Yet no bodies were ever recovered. No raft was ever found intact. The official line was simple: the men had drowned in the bay, swallowed by the merciless currents, their bodies dragged to the ocean. But the FBI's certainty was shadowed by doubt, because these weren't reckless men. They were methodical, brilliant, patient. Frank Morris had an IQ in the top 2% of the population. The Anglin brothers had been raised as fishermen, experts in water, strong swimmers hardened by years of labor. To say they drowned seemed almost too convenient. And then came the whispers. Sightings of the brothers in Brazil, photographs surfacing decades later of 2 men who bore striking resemblance to John and Clarence Anglin, family members receiving unsigned postcards, and investigators claiming the handwriting matched. In 2013, a letter allegedly written by one of the Anglins arrived at a police station, claiming they had survived, lived in hiding, and grown old under false names. The FBI never proved it, and officially the case remains unsolved. But each clue, each rumor, added to the mystery, turning the Alcatraz escape into one of the greatest legends of American history. Today, the rock stands empty, a museum of steel and stone, a monument to isolation. Tourists walk the same cell blocks where Morris and the Anglins plotted, staring at the vent holes, the dummies, the crude raft on display. But the real ending remains untold. Did the men freeze beneath the Golden Gate, or did they succeed in pulling off the impossible, outsmarting not just the guards of Alcatraz, but the entire system built to contain them? More than 60 years later, the question still echoes over the bay. 3 men vanished into the night, and no one has ever truly known what happened next.